Hill by R. Ellis Roberts. It was one of those hard, precise evenings, when, before sunset, everything seems to become flat. The fields that lay just in front of me were cut out of cardboard. The long road down to Broadoak appeared to stretch not to the country, but to a backcloth, and the trees that overarched the lane to Symondsbury were untouched by any breeze that might give them the illusion of reality. For when the country takes the decorative note, it is reality which is the illusion. One almost imperceptibly flattens oneself along the hedgerows in order to avoid breaking the perfect truth of the theatre, which nature contrives so much more skilfully than man. I was tired and walked a little listlessly. I had business to do in Bridport, but I knew I should be there long before 7, and I enjoyed sauntering down the road, while the decadent sun of early April made green tinsel out of the budding larches, while soft little puddles of brown glowed from the ruts and the hoof marks in the sandy soil. I was feeling well in a genially tired way, and quite ready for the walk home again, feeling, however, singularly unsharp. I mean that my senses, after the exertions of the week, were rather sleep-haunted. I had caught nature's lesson, and felt all this activity of limb and thought to be the substance of nothing but a rather beautiful dream. My mind was as casual as my walk, and was occupied, so far as I remember, with nothing more arresting than some vaguely pleasant remembrance of a youthful affection. I dwell on all this because I want to insist that I was not in an observant mood, not at all in the state to make the adventure I had likely. Those to whom I have told this story have all insisted that my imagination, or fancy, has made more of the facts than they warrant, that I was deceived by shadows, or misled by reflections, that my eyes were tired and played me tricks, that my memory is false and ill-suited to exact accuracy. So I would insist that such imagination as I have was almost quiescent, that my mind was singularly unalert, and that nothing can explain the extreme vividness of my recollection of that night of April 3rd, except the truth of what I saw. Its very incongruity, not only with my mental condition, but with the actual character of the evening, with the verdant artificiality of that Dorset springtime, when the countryside is rather less actual than the contour on an ordnance map, is a witness to the reality of that experience. I had indeed forgotten the hill. I generally used to look out for the first sight of it, when the road begins to run under the shoulder of the wooded height, and to skirt the hill of sacrifice. I don't know who gave it that name, whether indeed it is more than a modern device of some local journalist, but it suits the hill. Everyone who passes along the main road from Chiddick to Bridport must see it, but its most characteristic aspect is only caught from the road between North Chiddick and Symondsbury. It is a curious, conical hill, covered with green grass, and generally delivered over to innumerable sheep. It reminds one instantly of those high places on which the ancient Hebrews honoured other gods than Jehovah, the places where Solomon built temples for the family godlings of his heathen queens. Everyone felt this about the hill, so it does not show any preoccupation of mine that I, too, always connected it with sacrifice and the stone square altars of the old faiths. I had never been up the hill. I never met anyone who had. It was out of the way, and would be, though an unnecessary little climb for one whom Fleet Street had left without the wind of his youth. The sheep which grazed there belonged to a farm in the valley, and found their own way up and down. Well, as I said, on that night I had forgotten the hill, and when I caught my first glimpse of it, I had a shock. I thought at first the shock was due to the vision of a familiar but forgotten object. I think when one, so to speak, re-sees a perfectly familiar object, it has a more active and energizing effect on the nerves than contact with something entirely new. Certainly the hill made me jump. I stood and stared at it, and as I stared I realized that the shock I had received was not entirely due to the hill's reassertion of its presence to my forgetful mind. The hill was different. I glanced hastily back along the road, and over to my left, where the fields stretched idly away. They were the same as they had been a minute ago. Comfortable, artificial, flat, with no more atmosphere than a landscape in a modern painting. Then I swerved back to the hill. It was ominous, alive, clamant, with some mystery that I had not guessed. I should explain that though it was the Hill of Sacrifice, no one had associated it with anything mysterious or unusual. It was obviously the servant of some settled, rather courtly religion, where the priests of the 2nd century Roman, journeying from Dorchester, had made polite augury at dawn. This evening, all that was changed. The hill threatened. It quarrelled vehemently with the rest of the landscape. It stood like something or somebody naked and hairy in the middle of a crowd of modish and courtly figures. It was like some primitive pre-Gothic idol in a French classical temple, or as if you sundered a picture of Watteau's with one of those brown, watchful Tahitians of Gauguin's. I stood and stared at the hill, and as I started I became aware of two things. First, there were no sheep on the hill. Their absence aided the strange, nude look of the thing. And I began to think that perhaps, after all, the change in the hill was my fancy. Then, as I looked, the hill lurched. That, of course, is an exaggeration, but it was the effect made on me by the movement of something that was almost up on the round crown at the top. With that movement, the power of the hill became active. Suddenly, and as by antagonism, I too leapt into mental alertness. The hill and I were there, enemies, but akin in this, that we were the players in the set scene. Still the green fields spread away to the back cloth. Still the road ran as a stage road runs to the wings. Still the sun, though now faintlier, flickered on green and brown, and turned them to paper and canvas. But now there were two lives on the stage, and the play was begun. Before starting for the hill, it is noteworthy that no other course but that of immediate access to my antagonist ever seemed possible. I looked at it once more, for I knew when I had scrambled through the hedge and across the first field, I should lose sight for a while of the top. I looked at the spot where the hill had shuddered, and I saw that it was a figure, apparently human and heavily burdened, which was now on the top, and against the blue-black clouds which the sun was even now burning into angry gold. I was now much too far away, I have always suffered from short-sightedness, to make out clearly whether it was man or woman, or what it was that the figure carried. Nor indeed did I greatly care. But I got through the hedge and started as quickly as I could for the summit of the hill. In the second field it was darker, and I felt that the atmosphere was a trifle oppressive, and there was a heavy, hot smell in the air, like musk. Of course, by now my imagination was at work, but I was not consciously inventing any explanation of what I saw or felt. I was simply bringing to bear on facts that were obtrusive all I had of perception and sensitiveness. I had not even then definitely decided whether what was abroad was evil or not. I knew it was an enemy, but it was inimical at present only in the sense of demanding effort and conflict. I could not proclaim that it was evil. As I climbed towards the lower slopes of the hill, still hidden from view by a thick hedge, I was not conscious of any definite aim. I knew where I had to go, but I had no idea of what I should find or what I should do. Just before I reached the final hedge, something happened which removed all doubt as to the nature of that which I had to fight. Abruptly, and beginning on one long, piercing note, a strange music clove the surrounding silence. After the first shrill rending of the evening's solitary quiet, the music went on with a wicked and luxuriant abandon that recalled to me all that I knew of the vague power of harmony for evil. It was not vulgarly lascivious or alluring. It had in it that higher note of defiance, that keener note of pride and power, and of certain, though dishonourable, rule, which distinguishes the realm of the devil from that of the world and the flesh. It had in it that perverse, ascetic note, that strain of rapture and endeavour and adventure, which the sons of Satan achieve no less than the sons of Christ. It gave out no single note of compromise or concession. It was music of the airless heights, of the wilderness, of the great wastes of sand, or the interminable vastness of evil waters, where the greater devils meditate and morosely scheme. When I heard it, all doubt dropped from me. There dropped, too, everything of the present. I knew the music. I knew somehow the player, and I knew his instrument. And as I went up the hill, I knew what task lay before me, and with whom I was to wrestle. I felt no fear, and no confidence. No fear as to the terror or extent of the conflict, and no confidence as to the result. The whole incident, though still to come, seemed a part of my life, not something that I could do or could not do, so much as something without which I would not be I. When I was through the hedge, the sun was set, but it was still quite light, and I hoped it would not be dark for almost another hour. I looked up to the top of the hill, and there was the figure I had seen, kneeling and piling stones on one another. He, for it was a young lad, was half turned towards me, but he was stooping over his work, and evidently had no idea of my approach. The music, which was getting louder every moment, seemed to come from the top of the hill, but I could see no signs of the player, nor indeed had I expected to. I looked carefully to my stick, and wished it had been of some stouter wood than cherry, and then started rapidly up the hill. As I went on, the music altered in character. From defiance it passed to menace, and from menace to a curious, thin anger that somehow seemed intended for other ears than mine. It was. The lad looked up, puzzled, and I saw him distinctly say something towards the sound of the music. Then he saw me, recognized me, I think, and started down the hill. The music stopped. I went on, and after a few minutes the lad and I met. We were both a little out of breath, and stood for a moment at gaze. He was a singularly beautiful boy, with one of those faces in which it is so hard to discover the lines which will afterwards coarsen and harden. He was about 17, and I remember that I had seen him working on some job between Allington and Ypres. At the moment his beauty was almost unearthly. It had no intellectual qualities, and little of character, but just that even bloom which marks young animals. There was in his eyes, however, a look far from animal, a look of exaltation, of absorption, and combined with it a hardness that showed me my task would not be easy. What he said was in curious contrast with his appearance. and in even odder discordance with what was in our hearts, and in the heart of the hill, and in the heart of that old musician, who this night, at least, was claiming the worship of his ancient altar. "You be trespassing, Mr. O'Brien." "I suppose I am," I answered. "It's so jolly to be in a country where trespassing doesn't do any harm. That's why I like Dorset and these great grazing fields." He looked at me as the country folk do when they don't quite catch what you say and yet don't want to confess to it. "No one be allowed up here. I must ask you to go down again, sir." His tone was very polite, but his eyes were set, and I saw his fingers twitching and noticed the tremor of his shirt above his scurrying heart. "Nonsense," I said. "I'm going to the top. Good night to you." And I started to get past him rather hurriedly and with little dignity, I'm afraid. With a sharp cry, he stepped in front of me. Before he could say anything more, I spoke again, as sharply as I could, for I would have given anything just then to avoid the fight and for the lad to go home. "What on earth are you doing, boy? You know perfectly well Mr. Goodyear doesn't mind where I go on his land. Besides, you have no business here. You are not in his employ, and I don't know that he would allow you here. Get out of my way." For the moment, my tone of ordinary annoyance staggered him. He became, for a minute, an ordinary good-looking lad who, through clumsiness, had offended one of the gentry and made a fool of himself. I kept hold on myself and waited to see him go away, apologetic and abashed. If this was the fight, I had feared unnecessarily. He began to turn on his heel, muttering some excuse, and I went on upwards when suddenly the music began again. Insistent, defiant, challenging. In a second he rushed round, and with hot, hurried words clung to my arm, impeding my way. I was not to go. He was meeting his girl. He wouldn't let me. He would break me if I did. Lies and appeals and foul threats followed each other as swift as sin. His face once more took on that strange look of unearthly beauty, of curious exultation, as he asked me not to go up the hill. And the music played faster and faster. After a struggle that lasted, I suppose, but for a few minutes, I broke away from him and ran towards the summit. All pretense was now thrown aside. The lad knew that I was aware of his purpose, knew that I knew who his companion would be, and what that awful music meant, as it broke the evening quiet of the spring fields with a challenge older and more hideous than any voice of cities or of civilization. I got to the top of the hill, with the lad close on my heels, and when I was at the top I realized suddenly that it was night. Not, I think, that the ordinary world was yet dark, but a mist, acrid and pungent, hung over the top of the hill, and seemed to settle on the rude altar which the boy had built. I could not see him, but I heard his breathing close on my right. I thought I would try one last chance to avoid the conflict, for now fear had entered my very marrow. "Come down," I said, trying to make my voice as self-possessed as possible and as ordinary. "Come down and I'll go too." There was no answer but his quick breathing, and then, on a note of the music, he began to sing. When he sang there was little trace of Dorset in his speech, and his voice was a beautiful treble, that of a boy whose voice is going to break later than usual. What he sang I cannot put down here. It soared up in unimaginable wickedness, clear and pure as crystal, full of thoughts and words that we believe to have forsaken our world. The music adapted itself to his song, and grew subtly and insolently wicked. The psalm of Satan rose up, invitatory, clarion, ascending to heights of sin that I did not know had ever been expressed in human words. The air grew hotter and the mist glowed with a strange, blurred light. The keen, acrid smell grew more intense, and the music shrieked more and more riotously, as though precluding some monstrous apocalypse. Then, with no warning, there was silence. I could hear nothing, not even my own breathing, and I could see nothing but the blurred glow that was, I judged, just over the altar. Then I heard a sound. It was a voice, but of an accent not human, and the words it spoke were not English. I remember how even then it struck me as odd that one should hear a voice in a Dorset field speaking in tones that belonged neither to the place nor to the age I lived in. It sounded very low, very sure, and very old. Old not with any quavering, but with that sacerdotal certainty of age-long experience, which people who are very old, or of a great tradition, so frequently possess. Yet any certainty I had caught in human voices seemed but a shadow beside the deep, awful solemnity of this utterance. The voice was magical, ecstatic, assured with an eternal assurance. I strained my ears to listen during the few seconds while the voice continued. But I could distinguish nothing except what I thought possibly was the syllable "pie," and I wondered if the sentence was in Greek. My senses by now were singularly acute. I had passed through fear into that strong, wine-glowing condition when one watches everything securely, oneself being external even to the dangers that are threatening one's body or soul. In this state, and in the boldness engendered by it, I took one step towards the glow that still shone over the altar. Long before I could approach, however, I was smitten, or rather not so much smitten as involved in a thick, palpable and hideous atmosphere. Never have I been so submerged by anything external. The sensation was partly like that caused by a quicksand, which will wrestle with one's leg or arm as though the sand were endowed with life, and when one pulls out the endangered limb, it is as if one sprung out of some being's lively jaws. So, with an automatic movement of repulsion, I leapt back and was released. Then the light glowed more brightly, and I saw my companion. He was standing stark naked, with his arms outstretched like an orantes on a catacomb fresco. His lips were still moving, and his gaze fixed intently on the glow above the rude stones he had piled up. Every moment the glow increased. I was only just over 3 yards from the altar, but the glow gave no heat, neither was there any smoke. Then, as the light grew, in the centre of it there appeared a figure, and yet not so much a figure as a face, nor so much a face as a presence. It had the same beauty, that intolerable and sinful beauty which the boy had, or rather it seemed to be that beauty. It was, however, never still, but passed with incredible rapidity from the expression of one sensation to that of another. It had that most singular quality which can occasionally be seen on earthly faces, a complete lack of unity. There was no central and availing character in which the details might inhere, and it was this lack which gave the presence its extraordinary sense of wrongness, of wickedness, of sin. It is a vulgar comparison, but the mode of its loveliness, the mode of its very expression, reminded me of nothing so much as a cinematograph, that dreadful invention in which the mimicry of life treads breathlessly and continuously on the heels of life itself, and yet never attains it. The same absolute lack of peace, of joy, of truth, shone at me from the glow on the hill of Symondsbury. As I was looking, feeling numbed and rather sick from my effort to penetrate that infernal barrier which surrounded the altar, the boy stooped down and picked up something which had escaped my notice. When he stood up again, I saw it was a spaniel, which from the droop of its head was either drugged or dead. I guessed the former. Round its neck was a cord, and at the end of the cord a knife, whose blade glanced in the strange glow, gleaming uneasily in the shadow of the night. Carrying the spaniel, the boy stepped forward. I waited anxiously. He, when he was within the circle of the light, not only appeared to feel no discomfort, but looked lighter, more at ease, supremely healthy. If it had not been for the look on his face and the careless way he carried the dog, one would have judged him walking towards some celestial instead of an infernal revelation. As he approached the altar, the presence over it retreated, or rather ascended, and hovered, ominous, giving a sort of benison to what was going to be done. For the strangest thing about that strange evening was not, perhaps, the events, so much as my unhesitating acceptance of them. As I said, I was in no expectant mood when I first saw that movement on the hill. Yet I never doubted that what I saw on the hill was an altar, never even questioned myself as to what the boy's purpose was, nor whom it was he was going to worship. Nor did he, in spite of the assumed ordinariness of our conversation, ever doubt that I was come to prevent his rites, if and how I could. Why this was, I leave to others. I have only to record the facts. As he stepped up to the altar, I felt once more that I must take some action, I knew not what. It seemed useless to approach any nearer to the circle of the sacrifice, and it was evident I could do nothing with the boy except by force, and he had on his side powers greater than I had on mine. But had he? Ashamed, I remembered my faith. Since this ghastly business had begun, I had uttered no conscious prayer, taken no steps to set in motion that vast spiritual machinery which is on the side of beauty and holiness. I made quick, in my foolish flurry, to remedy my mistake. Hurriedly I scampered through an Our Father and Hail Mary, and, making the sign of the cross, walked towards the altar. Once more I was sucked in, though this time with greater force, and it needed considerable effort, as well as natural revulsion, to pull myself out of the circle, and then I fell back on the clean, dark grass, trembling with futile excitement. As I stumbled out, the presence laughed, and the boy echoed it, anything more horrible in its perfection, more cruel in its note of absolute and casual conquest, I never expect to hear. I felt not only beaten and baffled, but silly and childish. I felt as though some huge force had been not so much victorious as possessive over me. The boy knew, it seemed, that I could offer no resistance, let alone any active interference. Maddened by the laughter, I dashed once more towards the altar, and again was first absorbed and then, by the strong reaction of my body, flung out of the ring, weak and helpless. As I was thus beaten for a third time, the music began again. This time it had lost its note of gay sinfulness, and was more ceremonial and evocative, but it still kept its undertone of essential vice. The grey of its formal progress was still marked by passages of scarlet and phrases of deep black. With the beginning of the music, the boy stooped, laid the dog on the altar, untied the knife, and swiftly cut some string that bound its legs together. As he did so, either because the effect of the drug had passed off, or because he touched the poor animal with the knife, the dog gave a little moan, I cannot hope to convey the effect on me of the dog's cry. Quite suddenly I felt that what I had to do was to save the dog, that possibly I should also have to struggle with the boy, and to fight that presence which still hung over the altar and glowed in the darkness of the night, but that everything else was incidental to saving the dog. The boy had now begun a new hymn, and this time he too used a language which was not English. Once again I stepped forward, and as I moved, the dog shrieked loudly, horribly. I rushed forward, and in a moment was involved in the atmosphere of terror and power. This time, however, instead of fighting against it, I tried to ignore it, and simply kept in mind the fact that I must save the dog. I caught the boy's arm just as the knife was about to come down behind the animal's shoulder, and with a quick jerk twisted his wrist, so that the knife flew out of his hand. With a snarl of fury, he turned on me. Still ignoring him, I caught at the dog and rushed towards the darkness. Then something caught me. The glow buzzed like a million bees. The face of the thing became altogether blurred with the rapidity of its changes, and gloomed once more imminent and horrible. Hands that were not hands plucked at the spaniel, feet that were not feet tried to trip mine. Whatever I caught changed and swelled and shrunk and changed, until I found myself, again and again, digging my fingers into my own palms, or clutching in foiled futility at the thick, obscene air. The smell was now rank and poisonous, and though there was no heat, I felt the sweat running down my brow. The boy had fallen, apparently in a fit, but still clung tightly to my ankles, and as I pushed and heaved and struggled through the night, I dragged his body with me. At first, as I say, the thing which was there had seemed to attack me, but after a moment this stopped, and instead of any active attack, I had to contend with what felt like a crushing, inchoate, and slime-covered mass. I was near the end of my resources, and there was still more than 1.5 yards of that atrocious glow to get through. As I fought on, the dog in my arms moved, gave a little bark, and snapped furiously at the air. Strangely enough, the effort of the animal gave me extra strength. I burst out of the clutch that was holding me, and the dog, still barking excitedly, fell exhausted, but outside the light. As I fell, my head struck something cold and sharp, and I fainted away. I woke in the morning to find a small spaniel anxiously licking my hand. I got up and saw some farmhands approaching with a hurdle. I feebly waved my hand and noticed that it was covered with blood. My head ached intolerably, and I put up my hand to it and found my hair was caked with dried blood. Then on the ground I saw a knife with blood on the blade. The men came up.
"Are you better, Mr. O'Brien?"
"Yes, I'm all right." And I tried to struggle to my feet, but my head swam, and I had to sit down again, rather ignominiously, on the ground. "I shan't need that hurdle, I don't think, but thanks very much. How on earth did I—" Then I recollected what my last conscious experience had been, and I could still smell that acrid stench.
"How did he get here? Why, we don't know. Farmer Goodyear's spaniel bitch brought us up here. She were in a terrible to-do. Don't 'ee remember all?"
I did, but nothing I could tell these men. I muttered something about having fallen against a stone, and they looked puzzled. I got up again and found I could stand. Yes, there was the altar, or rather its ruins, for the stones had fallen. I began to walk along with the men when I noticed some pebbles arranged rather curiously around the altar. I looked more closely at them and spelled out in Greek letters the words Pan, Priapus, Apollo. And then I knew under what titles the boy had come to sacrifice to evil, and with whom I had fought that night. I stooped and caressed the dog, who was frisking at my side in extravagant pleasure.
"He must have a pup of hers, Mr. O'Brien. She won't be long now,"
said one of the men. That afternoon there was a caller, or rather two, at my cottage. My little maid came and told me that Mrs. Toogood would like to see me, and a woman entered whom I knew well by sight. She was evidently in great distress. When she was a little calmer, she told me how her boy, who had just begun work as a railway porter, had been rather odd lately, humming to himself, and looking, as she expressed it, all overish. This morning she had gone to wake him and found him looking dead white. No effort of hers could rouse him from a slumber that seemed deeper than natural. She made up her mind to send some excuse to the station and ran round for the doctor. When he came, the boy was awake. He seemed, Mr. O'Brien, to be a child again. He just put his arms round me and kissed me, which he hadn't done for 3 weeks. But he can't speak. "Can't speak?" I echoed. "Not a word," she sobbed. "The doctor says he's in shock." Here she broke down again and wept. I sat wondering. "I suppose, Mrs. Toogood, you don't know whether he was out last night?" "Out? No, sir. I still go up and see him after he's in bed, and he was in at 9:30. He was very curious, though, and didn't say a word to me, though I knew he was awake." "Ah, but earlier in the evening, about sunset?" "No, sir. He was home to supper, though he didn't eat a bit, and wouldn't speak a word. But it's this morning, sir. Though he's so kind and nice and happy, he had such odd ideas. He got a slate and wrote on it, 'I belong to Mr. O'Brien.'" "What?" I said. "I belong—" "Yes, sir, that's what I'm telling you. And the doctor said we mustn't excite him, though he doesn't get annoyed like he used, and so I've brought him up here. I thought you might help me, sir." "Where is he?" "Outside, sir." She rose eagerly. "May I have him in?" "Yes," I answered. In a minute she was back with her son. There was no doubt about it. It was the same boy. He was not less beautiful than I had thought, but this morning there was nothing sinister or evil about his beauty. He saw me, and then, with a grace very rare in an English boy, knelt and kissed my hand. I hastily drew it away, and asked him, "What do you want?" With a smile that was quite jolly and boylike, he darted into a corner where there was a pair of old boots of mine, and went through the motions of polishing them, then looked first at me, then at his mother, with an air of plaintive request. Well, after some discussion that lasted longer than it needed, the boy became my servant. He was perfectly sane, though more childlike than most country boys. He has never recovered his voice, but he is so quick that one hardly realizes his dumbness. I can give no explanation of how he was on the hill of sacrifice at the same time that he was at home eating his supper, but would suggest that there is more than modern incredulity will admit in those old stories of the Sabbath, when demons assumed the places of men, and women who were temporarily absent from their homes entangled in the lures of the devil. Farmer Goodyear had to give me, not a puppy, but Jessie herself, for she ran to my cottage that evening, and has lived with me ever since. There's a good girl, Jessie. There's a beauty. Yes, there's a good girl. There you go. Lie down. Today's story was The Hill by R. Ellis Roberts. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. Well, I do hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, sweet dreams.